Teutonic and too Protestant to face scrutiny. As this happens, and as the PIGS countries, so-called PIGS countries, have led to economic tremors, we find then that a central feature, the currency of Europe, being in play and being contested is creating an ontological crisis. This then is exacerbated for Europe with the issue of the refugee crisis, putting into specific relief some of the fissures that come into other definitions and markers of European identity, particularly open borders and the absence of inspection with documents. Over the past year, several countries have now suspended these policies indefinitely until the refugee crisis is over. But again, if arguably these policies were so steadfast, there would not be the need to abrogate them. Part of the moral panic gripping Europe, especially some countries in Western Europe, is tied to the loss of empire. While blame is readily given to migrant communities for their failure to integrate and embrace so-called Western values, which seem to be on a sliding scale, it is these countries who have not yet come to terms with their own decolonization. Furthermore, concomitant with this inability to face the erosion of perceived power, it has become even taboo to make the observation, particularly if the observer is seen as connected to the once colonized. 3 days ago, outgoing Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, made headlines by criticizing President Obama for the American leader's remarks in relation to the debate over Britain's possible exit from the EU. Johnson cited Obama's Kenyan heritage as being the reason for the president's, and I quote, ancestral dislike for the British Empire, unquote. Now, Johnson's aspersions suggest that the president has no right nor agency as a non-white individual with a genealogy linked to Britain's colonial past in East Africa to challenge the moral rectitude of empire. Apparently, Obama's stature and authority as the American president does not insulate him from the racial contempt behind Johnson's conceit. Obama's heresy is ingratitude for the bestowment of colonialism upon a purported inferior, unenlightened population. Of course, the real irony is that Johnson's paternal great-grandfather was Ali Kemal Bey, a Turkish journalist, and Boris's grandfather, Johnny Johnson, was born Osman Kemal. Perhaps Johnson's verbal attack on the president is a sign of transference, born of frustration in light of a deep-rooted ontological crisis he himself feels as the mayor of one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world. Johnson's unprovoked criticism of President Obama addresses a key component of the ontological crisis facing Europe, its inextricability from Islam and the shattering of the line of demarcation between the Oriental and the Occidental that is so sacrosanct for the West to use as a cultural, ideological, and ontological barrier. As Brian Turner has argued, quote, unlike Hinduism and Confucianism, Islam has major religious and historical ties to Judaism and Christianity, unquote. This may allude to the cause of what has perplexed and vexed Western notions of ontology, that orientalizing Islam cannot be properly done without orientalizing the West simultaneously. Islam is not, quote, of the East, unquote, nor does it reside in the liminal spaces between East and West. Islam, however, does rest within a liminal space. It is the fulcrum for the seesaw-like dialectic within Western societies as their so-called values and principles are debated and contested. American opinion makers like Jon Stewart, Cenk Uygur, and Keith Olbermann, for example, eagerly launch passionate defenses of Islam and the treatment of Muslims in their diatribes against political opponents, invariably them being on the political right. Similarly, the demonization of Muslims by conservative politicians and media figures highlight and compare Muslim causes and alliances with progressive groups and agendas, demonizing them and perhaps being seen as more egregious because they are the other. Now, getting back to Gladwell. Looking at the Gladwellian analysis, neither the United States nor Europe has achieved a true tipping point, is my argument, which suggests then that this process is more glacial than it is seismic. The impending demographic shift in the United States and the anxiety over the viability of the EU and Europe, respectively, do not constitute a new, instantaneous phenomenon. Each has been decades in the making. Furthermore, whereas the American turn to a majority-minority nation is inevitable and will occur within a generation, the possible collapse of the EU is still an open and highly premature question. Consequently, it may be equally premature to assess whether the present is a sufficient and accurate moment in time to gauge as a tipping point for Islamophobia. Gladwell states that one factor for a tipping point success is the so-called law of the few, whereby an idea to the attention of one or more special class of people in society is then prudent. These groups would be connectors, i.e. those who possess and can connect several networks, mavens, those who feel personally invested in the idea to be disseminated and are ambitious to disseminate it, and promoters who encourage and persuade those not previously inclined to the idea to subscribe to it. And here we find that Islamophobes can be categorized into two different subgroups. One, of course, are professional Islamophobes who persist in spreading anti-Muslim hate as a means for economic and or political gain, and those who are, amateur Islamophobes who don't want to lose out on going to the Olympics, I guess, who harbor bigoted attitudes that may or may not be limited to Muslims. Some of the examples of professional Islamophobes and how they connect the networks of both their own industry with other circles like the political are the advisors to current Senator from Texas and presidential candidate Ted Cruz, Frank Gaffney, who is from the Center for Security Policy, and retired Lieutenant General Gerald Boykin. Donald Trump does not want to be left out. His own advisor on foreign policy, especially on the Muslim world, is Waleed Faris, all of them known as, according to Fear Inc., as major purveyors of Islamophobia. So we have here, at least from a Gladwellian perspective, a yes when it comes to the law of the few. That does exist. Gladwell also goes to the second point, stickiness, the small and big factors that affect an idea. The current social-political viability in both the United States and Europe, respectively, may have a particular focus today on Muslims and on Islam, but neither is the sole, even arguably primary target of the current malaise and invective. While extremist acts such as those committed in San Bernardino, California, in Paris and Brussels, gained great currency in the public discourse, and some state policy was amended in reaction to them, they may still be considered as lacking what Gladwell would say is stickiness, i.e. shifting the discourse of Islamophobia or related policy measures directly affecting Muslims in the West significantly. One might argue that previous issues regarding extremism or securitization had a more seismic effect. We also find that the dominant trope of bigotry may not be Islamophobia per se, but that it is located within other similar bigotries based on race, sexual orientation, gender, and immigrant status. Gladwell's third law for a tipping point is the power of context, i.e. examining whether the time and place of the current Islamophobia in the US and Europe are unique to this time and place. Clearly, Islamophobia predates the current time period in both cases by several centuries. The otherization of the Muslim began in America with the forced conversion of African slaves as they were brought to pre-Revolutionary War America, and this has persisted in some form ever since. At various other moments in American history where moral panics were amplified, such as the US Civil War, World War II, the Civil Rights era, Muslims were not directly targeted or the object of persistent and pervasive animus. Their Muslim identity was either incidental to their discrimination, or the discrimination was over a broad spectrum of suspect groups, of which Muslims may have happened to be one of many. I'd argue that as a result of the Gladwellian troika, that we are not at a tipping point regarding Islamophobia, because Islamophobia is at the same time both part of a Western dialectic dealing with its ontology, and at the same time it is also a dialectic itself. Moving on, in the United States and in Europe we find that xenophobia is neither a new nor a unique phenomenon, and it's important to then recognize that particularly in Europe, the grand design of the European Union is at best considered to be fundamentally flawed, as Foucault would say, and for those who are more idealistic, as Habermas would say, that it is merely an unfinished project. And yet, as this realization and as these choices become much more profound and much more pervasive in European intellectual discourse, we find that these panics are becoming more pronounced and manifesting themselves. When asked in 1972 about his thoughts on the consequences of the French Revolution, then Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai replied that it was too soon to tell. Of course, he may have been mistaken in that he might have been thinking of the 1968 Paris Commune, not what happened in 1789. But I feel that the response is apt in either case. it's important to take a look at the longue durée and see how these processes play out. Similarly, it may be premature to assess whether we are currently in the midst of a tipping point regarding Islamophobia. While the inquiry of whether Islamophobia has reached a tipping point may be a helpful and an important one, suggests that Islamophobia is the variable of a social-political equation. Rather, American and European society, respectively, seems to be more contingent upon whether the United States and Europe, or the West collectively, has in fact reached or reified its own ontological tipping point. And we find that, and Dr. Bazian raised this question in the very beginning, introductory remarks, about whether this is looking at the issue from the cup half full or half empty. Well, looking at it through the Gladwellian analysis and looking at the three laws, the laws of the few, the laws of stickiness, as well as the law of context, it seems as though, again, it's premature to see if Islamophobia is in fact at that tipping point. It's not a matter so much of looking at the cup half full or half empty. Perhaps the corollary to this inquiry is contingent upon the cup bearers, i.e. the West, determining what exactly are the dimensions and capacity of the cup they are holding. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third panelist today is Professor Adnan Hussain. Professor Hussain is an associate professor at the History Department at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where he is also the Queen's National Scholar of the Medieval, Mediterranean, and Islamic world. His presentation is the second of two presentations. It's entitled The Formation of a Crusading Society, Medieval Paradigms and Modern Prejudice. Professor Hussain.
Well, first, while we're getting that ready, thanks very much for hanging in there here on the second day, the afternoon panel. And also thanks to very much to the preceding papers and from papers I heard yesterday. A lot of really excellent presentations, and very fitting in a way to come right after Saeed, as hopefully will become parents of whoever designed these panels. Bravo. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So on September 16th, 2001, on a national day of mourning, George W. Bush came out, addressed the nation, and in which he encouraged everyone to get back to work, because that's, of course, what the most important thing to have said at that time was. And then took questions from the press. One of which was about impending, rumors of impending enhanced law enforcement authorities to surveil things to disrupt terrorism that might be planned here in the United States. The question was, what will that mean for the rights of Americans? What will that mean? The person was cut off. George Bush went on a long ramble that talked about the barbarism, the special barbarism that we were facing, and concluded and the American people are beginning to understand, this crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while, and the American people must be patient. I'm going to be patient. Now, of course, it would be possible to dismiss this very early framing of the global war on terrorism in religious terms, and in particular this analogy of the crusade. We could, however, observe some of the other episodes of controversy in the mid-2000s, like that surrounding comments of General William Jerry Boykin, that characterized the global war on terrorism in precisely religious terms and used the metaphor and the experience, or at least the recollection of crusade to frame and understand his perspective. Certainly we would have to characterize these as somewhat extreme and generally unrepresentative of U.S. policy. However, I think given the mainstreaming in current presidential politics, and it was already mentioned that many of these figures are now part of Republican presidential advisory groups, that we might have to ask, why are these discourses so comfortable, so familiar and easy as refrains for contemporary politicians in Europe and the Middle East? And so my suggestion is that perhaps a longue durée perspective might allow us to appreciate the genealogies of some of the fundamental elements of even contemporary Islamophobic discourses and patterns that are part of these familiar repertoires of a European political and cultural imaginary. So I would suggest, if we're concerned to understand this kind of spilling or this effusion of Islamophobic discourse in our political culture, we need to pay attention to that cultural reservoir and examine it over a long period of time. We heard some presentations yesterday that located some of the origins of these shifts in the 1492 moment, or in the 1609 expulsion of the Moriscos, so the forced converts of Spain, who nonetheless were expelled even despite their forced conversion and the fact that they technically were Christians. But I would suggest that there's even a longer frame that's relevant to take into account, and that is to examine the medieval crucible and the formation of what I would like to call a crusading society in the Latin West. So building on a previous presentation at the Montreal Islamophobia conference that examined the associations between Jews and Muslims, that links discourses of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and I really wish some, I don't know if they're here, but I really wish some of the people who are raising concerns about Muslim anti-Semitism could have heard that talk. This study that I'm embarking on now traces the role that the Crusades had in the formation of Latin Christendom and its consequences on religious minorities, in particular the construction of Islam and Muslims as a political and theological enemy. Now, what I have reference to, and what my title is playing on, important scholarship, a very important work in medieval European history, a book by R.I. Moore called The Formation of a Persecuting Society. And in that book, he identified, and others have built upon this early identification, that there were crucial changes that took place in 12th and 13th century Europe that created perduring patterns of persecution. Persecution in particular, he studied of Jews, of dissidents, religious dissidents, so heretics, and marginal groups that were created and produced as dangers to the rest of society. Lepers, prostitutes, groups around which moral panics could be generated and formed. And his suggestion was that since the 12th and 13th century, a certain kind of formula of political culture in the Latin West emerged that continued to have enduring effect and consequences, and that Europe, the sort of successor to what we might think of as Latin Christendom, never gave up the logic of persecution that may have developed and taken on different forms. Seldom, however, and it's absolutely astonishing, when I first read this book as a graduate student, I just could not believe that nowhere in his analysis did he ever talk about Muslims or about the Crusades in this analysis. So, and I would say very typically, Crusade historiography, the study of the Crusades, is very seldom integrated in the grand narrative of Europe and its transformation. So it's something that happened, it's an interesting episode, but it isn't fundamentally constitutive for most, historians of Europe. It isn't fundamentally constitutive of the kind of culture, society, and polity that Europe would become. Obviously, I think that's a mistake, and this paper would like to examine the interaction between Latin Christendom's internal dynamics of persecution and its external sanctification of war for the Holy Land more holistically as the formation, as I said, of a crusading society. And it tries to examine further how this medieval paradigm structures and provides the repertoires of many contemporary neo-crusading discourses that link global military intervention and anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia in Euro-North American political culture. I want to suggest that these aren't just parallels and analogies, but they're evidence of some deeper processes that, despite a predominantly secular public sphere, are relevant to analyzing Islamophobia. I'm not suggesting that there is, from the medieval period, a straight line without things transforming and a lot of other factors being involved, but that we miss something if we don't take our analysis further back and do this sort of longue durée approach. Okay, so I've probably already wasted a lot of time with prolegomena, and it's a very big topic in a way to try and present this sort of history of a few hundred years of medieval history. So I just want to put out at the outset that the kind of three main issues that I'm most interested in pursuing are these, in case I don't get a chance to give them their full due consideration. That is the construction of the Muslim as the enemy, a privileged enemy, even as there are so many enemies in this persecuting society or crusading society. The crusade and the creation of an idea of Christendom is absolutely constitutive. And then finally, the way in which the crusade and the persecuting society go together, that is, the way in which that external military confrontation, structured paradigms of persecution of minorities of religious difference within. Okay, so and I would say that that's, in a way, the most important point that I have to make today, is that there is an interlinkage between those two things. Usually when we theorize these kind of sociological questions, we take a kind of view internally of the dynamics of society, but what I want to suggest is that it really is very important to take into account this greater confrontation, what we might think of, if we're translating to modern political terms, foreign policy has ramifications on domestic policy, and a full and complete analysis of oppression can't do with dismissing one or the other or separating and delinking those things. Okay, so let's go to our historical period. Urban II's speech at Clermont, 1095. There are a number of versions of this. I'm referring here to the Robert the Monk version. I'm not going to go through and read all of this for the sake of time. But I want to point out a couple of things very quickly. Is that, of course, in order to justify the crusade, there's a discourse of demonization of the Saracen, who are regarded and characterized as idolatrous pagans and heathens, so they're worshippers of idols as far as the Latins are concerned and interested in. In one of the accounts of the First Crusade, there's a point at which they note that the Saracens are inimici Dei et sanctae Christianitas, that they are the enemies, particular enemies of God and of holy Christendom. And there we see the two coming together. And I'll talk a little bit more about Christendom in a moment, or in a few moments.